Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mackowski, and today is my friend Charlie Knight joining us. Charlie's the author of the Magisterial From Arlington to Appomattox, the day-by-day guide to Robert E. Lee's Civil War career. Charlie, how are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you very much. I wanted to put in a plug for your book because this is one of my favorite um, Civil War reference books since it came out. It is just fantastic.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah. A lot of work went into that. Yeah.
There's that great note you have in the dedication to the archivist, like, yes, I do need to see that one last little thing one more time because I mean, this is so comprehensive. It's a wonderful book. So,
Yeah. Yeah. She kept asking me exactly what I want to see out of the collection. I'm like, well, I don't know. How am I supposed to know what I need to see if I don't know what there is?
so this book's available from Savage Beatty. Definitely check it out. I asked Charlie to join us because as we're talking about rivalries and partnerships heading into the Emerging Civil War Symposium, I'm really fascinated by Robert E. Lee and kind of the partnerships and relationships he has around him with guys like Joe Johnston and P.G.T. Beauregard. And so I thought Charlie would be a good person to kind of come on here and talk a little bit about some of that stuff. Um, First of all, Charlie, just as a kind of a baseline, give us your quick thumbnail sketch of Robert E. Lee and who is he and why is he important to you particularly?
Well, I'll answer the last part of that first, the why he's important to me. I grew up in Richmond. So, Lee was pretty much everywhere, driving around Richmond, the Dabb's house, the Capitol, the house there on Franklin Street. I remember when there used to be the restaurant and I think the basement of that was called Traveler's Alley or something like that. So yeah, it was, my dad was a big Civil War buff, so, Lee was always there when I was growing up in some way, shape, or form. And I remember in high school, Emory Thomas was working on his Lee biography, and he was a visiting professor at the University of Richmond, did a series of public lectures there. And that was probably really the first time, I ever actually heard, one of the big names, if you will, actually give a talk about Lee, and it was just it was fascinating to me because he chose not to focus on Lee the soldier. I mean, he did one lecture that was about Lee at Gettysburg, but the rest of that series was about the non-military aspects of Lee the educator, and I forget what the others were, but that really opened my eyes up to hey, there's so much more to Lee, and that prompted me to read what's his name, the Flood, is that his name?
Oh
The
yeah,
guy
Charles
that
Braceland
wrote,
Flood.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, him. The post-war bio of Lee, primarily the W&L years, and it just all of that really just kept my interest in Lee really snowballed, if you will. So as the more I learned, the more I wanted to know about him. And as far as kind of a capsule sketch, I guess, of Lee, you'd be hard pressed, I think, to find another commander, who was as beloved by his troops. Eisenhower, is probably the best comparison I can think of. But he was just absolutely beloved, by almost all of his army, not so much by some of his officers, but the men in the ranks, they loved him, and he just really came to symbolize the war for a lot of these guys, in the post-war years. I think part of that stemmed from Lee's early death, and he bowed out, before the war of words started between most of these guys. And personally, I think that would have disgusted him to see what was going on. But yeah.
Yeah, it's well, and I agree with you because, because composure was such an important thing to him and decorum, and things got messy in that war of words, which was really a violation of that, the decorum that a good gentleman should have.
Right. Right.
No, Lee is one of those guys. He can be hard to understand. He can be hard to parse out. I admit I have trouble sometimes kind of figuring him out because he has become so mythologized. How would you recommend someone who's learning about the war, or maybe even someone who's been doing war studies for a while? What's a good way to approach Lee so that we can kind of get to know who he really is?
Well, I think one of the most important things to keep in the back of your mind, when you're reading about Lee during the war, it's very easy to get lost. And this is true of really any Civil War figure. It's easy to get lost, in the fact that they're a person. They have other stuff going on, outside of the military career. And for Lee, that was especially true. I mean, the war, left him in, financial ruins. He lost one of his children. His wife becomes an invalid during the war. One of his sons is pretty much held hostage, by Union forces because his last name was Lee during the war. I mean, it's easy to lose sight of these non-military things that have an influence on a lot of the day to day stuff. And that was something that really struck me when I was doing this day to day approach of Lee. You're reading the family letters, and you can see, well, there's trouble going on at home. Well, maybe that's why he was not in the best of moods. Later that day. Maybe that's was part of the reason why he jumped on Charles Venable so many times.
Yeah.
Venable had just happened to have bad luck and catch him at a bad moment or something. But
Yeah.
yeah.
I remember back in my days in college when I did theater, I had a director who said, as you're developing character, character can manifest itself in three ways: what a person does, what a person says, and what other people say about them. And that's how an audience learns about somebody. And what I loved about your book was like, here's a chronicle of what he did. And it's a real granular approach to kind of discovering who this guy is. Because here we see day to day, here's what he's doing, here's what he's doing, here's what he's doing. And I think that shed a light on him in a way that I really had not understood from any other source, primary or secondary, that I had looked at about Lee,
Mhm.
which is, I think, what made it so fascinating and effective as a text.
Right, right. Yeah. One of my favorite things that I didn't know about prior to doing this research was, April 2nd, 1865, when things are just, completely falling apart at Petersburg. Not only does he have to worry, about how to save his army, and personally avoid capture, because he came pretty close to having his headquarters overrun. But, while all that is going on, and he's, fuming at Jeff Davis, for saying, "What, evacuate? What do you mean? Why didn't you tell me we had to evacuate sooner?" All that stuff. His daughter Agnes is in Petersburg while all this is going on, and he's trying to figure out, how to get her safely out of the
Yeah.
city, while he's trying to save his army. So yeah, it's fascinating, the little tidbit, the little human interest, I guess you'd call it, tidbits that are out there.
Yeah, you never stop being a dad. It was a great
Right,
point. Like you get the army on your shoulders, and you're still worrying about being a dad. Yeah.
right.
So, and Lee, of course, he cast this long shadow, and that shadow falls over two of his other full generals for the Confederacy, Joe Johnston and P.G.T. Beauregard. And kind of their ranking, of course, becomes a source of contention between some of them or between them and Jefferson Davis. Walk me through your perception of that whole order of rank and how it impacts these guys from very early on in the war.
When you're talking about those three guys, I think rank was far more important to Johnston and Beauregard than it was to Lee. Lee, says, over and over, I just want to do what I can for my state, whatever she needs, I'm here to do. And, then on the other hand, you got Johnston, who's ticked off, what do you mean I'm not in charge? I was a senior guy, I outranked all these guys. And, Beauregard, just strikes me as, just completely, vainglorious, giant ego, he's out for himself, and if anybody else happens to benefit along the way, hey, great. But, that's just, of course, my opinion of him. But, he seems to be really out for himself and had some really outlandish ideas out there. But, and Lee knew them both from before the war. Of course, he and Johnston, knew each other, going back all the way to West Point years, both being from Virginia, they, had formed a friendship in the old army. And, Lee served with Beauregard in Mexico. And I don't know how true it was on Lee's part, but, there seemed to be a little bit of, I don't know if jealousy is the right word, envy, whatever you want to call it, on Beauregard's part toward the attention that I think Lee was getting in Mexico, because Beauregard's like, well, I'm over here doing the same work. Why is Lee getting all this attention? And I'm not even an afterthought. I'm not even a footnote in any of these reports. Um, but Johnston and Lee, I think, definitely clicked a lot better than Lee ever clicked with Beauregard. I think Beauregard was just kind of there, and Lee had to figure out what to do with him. When he got to, when they all got into the senior ranks in the Confederate Army. But yeah, it's interesting to see the interpersonal dynamics between these guys. And Lee and Johnston are definitely different individuals. Lee succeeded in areas where Johnston failed, both on and off the battlefield. But they definitely had a good respect, good friendship, I think, between
It
each other.
it seemed like there was a good, healthy friendship rivalry between Lee and Johnson very early on and through the Mexican War. And when things start kind of heating up and secession takes place, and both of these men decide to go with the South, and they have very different reasons for kind of wanting to do it. But Johnson feels like he was a brigadier general during the professional army. He should be higher ranked. And yet Lee somehow leapfrogs him above that on the final listing that comes out and shows up at number three, and then Johnson at number four.
Right.
Um, and Johnson had a pretty healthy ego. Do you think that Lee also had a healthy ego?
He did somewhat, not to the extent that the others did. I mean, he was definitely out to do. Um, he was seeing big picture. And if any glory attached itself to him, I think he was fine with that. That wasn't his main driving force, unlike a lot of these guys. But yeah, there was definitely, I think, a little bit there. But like I say, not something that was overpowering. Especially not compared to those two.
Yeah. And just for folks who are kind of unfamiliar with the listing, of course, Samuel Cooper's number one, number first. He's number one. He's the adjutant general for the Confederate Army, never leaves Richmond. Number two is Albert Sidney Johnston. He gets sent to the West. Lee's number three, then Joe Johnson, than Beauregard. What do you know about Beauregard's kind of involvement in those early days of the war? Because he doesn't have quite that same link to Virginia or link to the Confederate government that Lee and Johnson do. Um, what can you say about his early days in the war and how he gets involved?
I haven't read a lot about Beauregard, so I'll start off with that caveat. But I think he winds up, in the spotlight there in Northern Virginia. I think it's pretty much, because of his success down at Fort Sumter. He's the war's first hero from a Southern perspective. So Davis, I think wanted to play that up and put him, where he thought he could get the best use out of him, and sitting there guarding Charleston Harbor, after the fall of Fort Sumter is probably not the best place, for somebody of Beauregard's stature. So Davis was, I think, trying to play the hot hand, if you will, there with Beauregard. Um, and part of that too, I think, may have also had to do with Lee as well, because early on in his command of the Virginia State Forces, Lee went on several inspection tours around Virginia, and he did not like what he found just about everywhere that he went. So I know Northern Virginia was one of the areas that he recommended, needed a replacement officer, and then I think that uh, kind of meshed well with what Davis was maybe looking to do with Beauregard.
And of course, Joe Johnson first assigned to Harper's Ferry because that's seen as a key strategic point. It's on the northern border, but that really kind of puts him in the Shenandoah Valley and opens up more of that central Virginia area. We need a war hero for that, and so Beauregard slides right in there and takes command. And then you have this weird, almost dual command structure between Johnson and Beauregard and who's in charge, and they've got to spend some time figuring that out. And during this period, Lee's out in the Western Mountains. I mean, he kind of gets assigned to go out west pretty quickly. Is that a good fit for Lee, do you think?
No, and definitely not with the orders that he was given. Like you said, it's about a week after Manassas. Lee is ordered out to Western Virginia, but his orders, the way it was worded, he wasn't to take command. He was there to coordinate and advise. His orders stopped short of putting him in charge, and Lee took that seriously. He didn't think he had the authority to interfere with a lot of these commanders out there, especially when he winds up with Floyd and Wise. But before he winds up out there, he's in the northwestern corner, and I think he did take a little bit. Well, I don't think he did take more of an active role in command out there. He actually did try and launch an offensive out there around Cheat Mountain, and it just wound up being a huge disaster. And the whole Western Virginia thing becomes a big learning experience for Lee. All these guys, they're learning on the job. Nobody has commanded troops of this size before, but especially for him. But I think he learned a lot about how to function with these volunteer officers. I think he realized very quickly, dealing with a volunteer officer is a lot different than dealing with the regular Army officer. There was one point where Henry Wise comes to him. Wise had just gotten orders from Richmond recalling him back to Richmond, and Wise came to ask Lee, well, what should I do about these orders? And Lee was kind of like, well, what do you mean? What should you do about these orders? You've been ordered to go back. You follow the orders. You go back. And Wise told him, I don't think I'm going to do that. That just I don't. It was such a completely foreign concept to Lee. That somebody would not follow their orders. And these guys, thought they had some say in this stuff, and that opened Lee's eyes a lot, I think. And it also was really the first time that the war hit home for him. One of his staff officers, John Washington, he was the last private owner of Mount Vernon, and he was a descendant of some description. I forget what the relationship was, but he was a descendant of George Washington, and he was serving on Lee's staff, and he was out doing some recon out along a creek out there in, I think, mid-September of 61. He rides into an ambush and gets killed. And reading Lee's letters, I've read hundreds of Lee letters from during the war, and Washington's death seemed to have just, really struck him, the way nothing else, even the death of his own daughter, didn't seem to hit him in quite the same way that Washington's death did out there, so he learned a lot. And like I say, I think the war really hit home for Lee out there as well.
And I'll point listeners to a previous episode of this podcast we just did with Kevin Pollock, where we talked about Joe Johnston and Beauregard together at Manassas and how they kind of figure out how to be generals in this particular situation and how to coordinate and stuff. So go back and take a listen to that for that component of the Lee Johnson Beauregard triangle. And after First Manassas, and Lee has those disappointments out in the Western Mountains. Lee kind of goes into a bit of a limbo where he's assigned to different duty, finds himself in Charleston. Kind of walk us through Lee's time in the wilderness, during those late months of 1861.
Sure. After West Virginia, that wound up being a huge disaster for Lee. Both he wound up in two separate parts of Western Virginia out there. Neither one of them really accomplished anything. Davis recalls him back to Richmond, and Lee, like you said early on, Lee was ever the gentleman. He didn't submit a written report. This was probably the only time during the war that he failed to submit a written report of a campaign. He gave a verbal report to Davis because, as he said, he didn't want it to reflect badly on any of the officers out there. He didn't want to call anybody out by name. Well, most of them needed to be called out for this, but, he didn't want to do that. But after that, it was right around Halloween, end of October, beginning of November, is when he's recalled. And then he's sent down, like you say, to the South Atlantic coast. He winds up in command of South Carolina coast, Georgia coast, Northern Florida coast. And his headquarters is right near the South Carolina-Georgia line. And he splits his time really between Charleston and Savannah. And his job was to prepare the defenses of those two regions. Charleston was the harbor itself was pretty well defended, so he didn't really have a lot to do there except for improving and maybe mounting some more guns. Savannah was not as well fortified at the time, so he had a little bit more work to do down there. And also, he realized that Savannah could very easily be cut off. Because if Fort Pulaski, if that was captured, that was pretty much going to close the river access out of Savannah. So that was one of his main things, was trying to figure out, okay, how do we make the fort, as strong as possible? And if it does fall, we need some secondary defenses down here to try and keep the Savannah open as a port. And he, like I say, he bounced back and forth between those two cities. He goes down to Florida a couple times. He actually visits his father's grave site on Cumberland Island for the first time. His father had been dead for decades, but he'd never been there to visit the site before. He does that while he's stationed down there. He's doing a lot of stuff behind the scenes. But because there's really no major action that takes place down there, he's really kind of overlooked. When I'm giving presentations about Lee, this is sometimes the first time they've heard about this. They
Mm.
just automatically think Lee, oh yeah, he commanded the army in Virginia. Starting right after Manassas. No, they had some other assignments between then, but yeah, he really doesn't get any notice in the press for what he's doing down there, but he really sets the stage for the defense of that area in later years. A lot of what he does around Savannah, keeps the Federals. Yes, they take Fort Pulaski, but that's as far as they can get. Largely because of the work that he does down there.
And then eventually he finds himself back in Richmond, and I'll invoke Charles Venable, his staff member again, who was writing about the North Anna campaign, and he said Lee confined to his tent was not Lee in the field. And how about Lee confined to the desk versus Lee in the field? How does office service fare for Lee, and how does he handle that assignment when he gets back to Richmond?
That was really kind of an awkward situation for Lee when he was recalled back to Richmond from down south. He thought he was going to be made Secretary of War.
Yeah.
Davis was looking for a change in that, and Congress even went so far as to authorize a change where there could be an active duty officer functioning as Secretary of War. So he thought that that's what he was going to do, and most of the population in the South thought that's what he was going to Richmond to do.
No,
Wound up not being the case. He
no,
has
no. Why,
this.
why would he have that in his mind? Because I'm sure some people are like, "Whoa, that's kind of, I've never heard that." Why would Lee even think that he would be considered for that kind of spot?
He actually was being kicked around as one of the names for it. They chose, I think, to go with somebody with a little bit more of a political background than Lee, or someone who was a little bit more political savvy than Lee at that point. But
Judah Benjamin ends up getting this slot at that point, I believe.
this would have been replacing Benjamin. Trying to remember
Oh, okay, okay.
who
So was it Randolph that was
he
before
was.
him?
Yes,
Yeah,
I think this is when Randolph slides in. I don't remember. I'd have
okay.
to
I
look it
feel
up.
like they're like drummers for Spinal Tap. They go through so many of them, I
Right,
lose track of when they come in and when they come out. Okay.
right,
So,
right. But yeah, they were looking for somebody that actually had military knowledge. They didn't want Davis running the war effort. They didn't want uh, Benjamin in there. Benjamin and Jackson had been oil and water. They didn't want a repeat of that. So they were looking for somebody. Lee's name was at the top of the list. He winds up not getting it. And he's slid into this new role of military advisor to the president. And that was kind of a concession. Davis, didn't want anybody looking over his shoulder, but Congress didn't trust Davis. There's a lot of anti-Davis movement at this time, so they thought, well, let's put somebody there to kind of hold his hand. And Davis didn't want it. Lee didn't want it. Lee didn't like the awkwardness that existed between him and Davis as a result. And Lee never really, I think, understood what it was he was supposed to be doing, because Davis never told him what he
right.
was supposed to be doing. So it was kind of, Lee would just kind of, push the envelope. Well, I'm going to do this, and if he doesn't say anything, I guess that's part of the scope of my authority, type of deal.
Yeah, and basically sort of suggests the Valley campaign to Jackson is all
Right.
that is part of all of that, right?
Right. Yeah. Lee is really the one who's behind the scenes moving a lot of the pieces on the chessboard here. And like you say, the Valley is one of those big things, but he's not dealing just with Virginia. He's dealing with, stuff out along the Mississippi, stuff back in his old department down south. This is until the last few months of the war. This is really one of the few times where he's looking at things, in a giant picture. He's looking at the entire Confederacy as his domain at this point.
Yeah, and tell me what you think of this statement. And this might be a bold or even incorrect statement on my part, but I think that at times in the war, Lee has a very Virginia-centric view. But I
Mhm.
think at this point in the war, he's got I think, a masterful strategic view of the war and understands kind of how all these pieces come together. And then it's only after he gets Army command that his view kind of shrinks a little bit. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. He was talking about things at New Orleans. He's talking about things elsewhere along the Mississippi. Like you say, he's really dealing with big picture overall, and it's not just Virginia focused. And of course, a lot of his attention is in Virginia, but it is elsewhere as well.
Yeah, yeah, and I think he's very good at it too. I
Yeah.
think he demonstrates it really good. All right, so I have done what I tell my students to do. If you don't know, look it up. So the internet tells me that Leroy Pope Walker was the first Confederate Secretary of War. There's going to be a quiz, kids. Take some notes. And he leaves that job in September of 61. Judah Benjamin from September of 61 through March of 62. George Randolph from March of 62 to November 62, then Seddon from 62 to 65, and then Breckinridge at the very end. So, in case we need to keep score again, there it is for us.
And you've got Gustavus Smith as acting secretary for about a week in there at
Yeah,
one point too.
yeah, hot
Yeah.
mess there.
Yeah.
So when Lee's then kind of taking this big strategic view behind the desk, one of the puzzle pieces he has to consider is Joe Johnson and his command of what will eventually become the Army of Northern Virginia, although it's not called that yet. How does Lee interact with Johnson during that spring of 62?
Lee, I think, was really trying to leave Johnston alone at first. There was some friction there. When Lee started dealing with Jackson, in the Valley, Johnston took offense to that because he viewed Jackson as being part of his domain. So they had to, Lee had to kind of, smooth some ruffled feathers there on Johnston's part at one point. Um, and then Lee could see everything that was going on. He read a lot of the correspondence, and if he didn't read it himself, Davis was telling him what was going on. So he could see that relations between Davis and Johnston were really starting to deteriorate, and he tried to play, the intermediary here, and as that relationship between Davis and Johnston gets worse, you can see Lee, slowly ramping up his efforts here, trying to get Johnston, you must keep Richmond informed, even if you don't know what the ultimate plan is, tell Davis something, you can't keep Davis in the dark, and that just starts to snowball, it's kind of like one of those econ graphs, as one relationship goes down, here's the Lee Johnston thing trying to play up a little bit. But yeah, Lee could see that there was some friction there. He's trying to help Johnston both as a friend and from a military point of view there, and it didn't happen.
So, and I want to come back to the Lee Davis thing in a second because obviously a key relationship of the war. But Johnson's relationship with Davis is really strained. And you allude here to the fact that Johnson just doesn't keep Davis in the loop. What would you attribute that stress and strain to? Why doesn't Johnston read the tea leaves very well?
Part of it, I think, Johnston was afraid ever to make mistakes. There's that story about him going hunting, going bird hunting, and he never shot a bird. Everybody else came back, with dozens of birds or whatever. He never even fired a shot, because he was afraid he might miss if he took a shot. I think that was part of the problem. Is he didn't want to fail, and I think part of it too was he didn't want to tell Davis what he was doing in fear, in part, I think that Davis, might interfere, because
Okay.
Davis was definitely a micromanager. Johnston was definitely a leave me alone. I'm going to do what I want to do thing. And, talk about, two stubborn individuals butting heads there. You'd be hard pressed to find better examples of that than Johnston and Davis. But, yeah, it just, they started off, cordial at the beginning of the war. And just for whatever reason, it was just some kind of personality conflict, between the two of them. It just, it went south in a hurry. But,
Uh,
you look at the relationship early in the war, Davis tried to be cordial to him. Johnston tried to be it back. And just for whatever reason, they did not click, and it just got worse, because if you tick off Davis, there's no coming back from that.
yeah, right. Yeah, Davis certainly knew how to hold a grudge. And of course, Johnson, he's carrying that grudge about being number 4 on the list. I mean,
Right.
that's just as a thorn he cannot get
Right.
past. So Johnson keeps Davis out of the loop. Lee's trying to help Johnston out. Then Johnston gets wounded at Fair Oaks, Seven Pines, and Davis essentially looks at Lee and says, "Hey, you take over." After a brief forgotten interlude by Gustavus Smith. And so Lee assumes command of what becomes the Army of Northern Virginia. And this is sort of the moment Lee's been waiting for, right?
Yeah, he'd been wanting a field command, and I don't know if Davis had ever mentioned anything about possibly relieving Johnston to him or what. I don't know of any conversation or any record of anything like that. But yeah, as fate would have it, Johnston is suddenly out of the picture. Smith does not impress Davis with their one interview there, and uh, Lee was there with Davis, so he was the right guy at the right place, and it was meant to be temporary. You look at the orders assigning Lee to command, and it just says you're in temporary command until Johnston recovers and can resume command of the army. And as we know, that never happened, and that too did not sit well with Joe. But yeah, Lee, when he first took command of the army, he had no idea, what Johnston's plan was, tactically for things. Smith, clearly didn't have a firm grasp on what was going on. So, any ideas that Lee was going to immediately, go on the offensive or whatever was just not realistic. So, it took him about a month to get things up to where he felt comfortable to do his own thing. But yeah, it worked out well for Lee and the Army.
So, and as Joe Johnston's recovering, because he's wounded twice and fairly seriously, it takes him what till November, I think, to
Mhm.
recover from that. Is he like back in Richmond recovering, sending notes to Lee saying, "Oh, you should do this or you should do that"? Is he interfering with Lee's temporary command during this period? Do you know?
I've never run across anything. I mean, there was a few, get well wishes, from Lee and, the response from Johnston. But as far as, like, what are you doing with my army type of thing, looking over his shoulder, that wasn't there. I don't know how long it took Johnston to actually get to a point, where he could, start to even try that type of thing, but it really never materialized.
And do you think that, I mean, because Johnson's wounded badly enough that it takes him so long to recover, I mean, that gives Lee the time to get his feet underneath him. At what point do you think the temporary command of this army becomes, oh, this is your army?
That's a good question. I'm not sure when that started to shift in the eyes of Davis and the others. Um, winning, the or driving McClellan away during the 7 days, that was definitely a good start. Had he lost, and I think that definitely would have turned out differently for Lee as well as the Confederacy. Um, but yeah, you know, driving McClellan away, then almost immediately, taking the war to Pope. It was just, Lee was displaying an aggressiveness, that Johnston had never even remotely hinted at before. Davis definitely liked the aggression there. He and Lee had learned from seeing the Davis Johnston relationship go down the drain. He knew what Davis expected from a commander. And he was able to provide Davis, the information that he wanted. He was also savvy enough, to let Davis make so he would give him leading questions for lack of a better way of phrasing it, where Lee knew what he wanted to do, but he wanted Davis to suggest, well, why don't you do this, so that way Davis could think it was his idea, type of thing. So Lee definitely knew how to work with Davis. But yeah, as to when exactly, that light bulb went off, as to, this isn't a temporary thing. That's a good question. I don't know.
Because to me, I mean, like, and I've thought about that a lot. And I mean, like, the 7 days certainly shows the aggressiveness that Davis and the cabinet, they're all looking for. Like, everybody in the South seems to be wanting to be on the attack. And Johnson's biggest flaw, aside from not communicating with Davis, seems to be that, like, he's just not going on the offense. He's doing that Fabian fallback thing. And then Lee comes out swinging, which on one hand is like, yes, that's what we want. But like the 7 days are kind of a disaster in a lot of ways for Lee. I mean, he
Yeah.
suffers some significant losses during
Yeah.
that campaign. So like you might think like, oh yeah, he's on the offense, but he also bleeds out his army pretty significantly. So maybe that's not such a great idea. But he manages to survive the 7 days, not only with his command intact, but it seems like with his prestige enhanced.
Right. Yeah. I mean, he really, he could really only go up, I think, in the eyes of the public, and the eyes of a lot of his men. You know, his West Virginia thing had been a disaster. Nobody knew what he had done down south. He was completely invisible as Davis's military advisor. When he first takes command, he tells the troops, put down your musket, pick up the shovel. I want you out there, fortifying the city. And that just did not sit well with the troops. But winning, would very quickly change their tune. But yeah, you're right. He did do a lot wrong during the 7 days, and that's still more of the learning as he went type of thing. And one lesson that I think he never really learned, and both West Virginia and especially the 7 days are huge examples of this, is how to effectively use his staff. That was
Yes,
one of his
yes.
big things. He never had adequate staff officers. He never used them correctly. Part of that was due to some of his staff officers, looking at you, Robert Chilton, being complete idiots. But even the competent ones, they were stretched so thin. They could not keep an eye on everybody. 7 days. With especially with Magruder and Jackson, and them not doing what they were supposed to. Had he had enough competent staff officers to go around to keep them their nose on the grindstone, keep them at what Lee wanted them to be doing, I think things could have definitely turned out differently. But Lee said early on when he took command, I don't want a big staff. I don't want people serving me when they could be out there carrying a musket. So he declared very early on, I don't want McClellan, and having European royalty following me around. I want people that know what they're doing and can do it, and are not scared of work type of thing. So
Yeah.
he really brought that on himself, really.
And then I agree. Staffing issues are just such a problem during the 7 days. I mean, probably is great, but like he's got to learn to use this army, and he's got to learn how to use the staff. So I mean, I can excuse the learning curve as a factor in that, but you're right that it doesn't get a whole lot better as the war
Right.
goes on for him, right?
Right.
Uh, and then momentum carries him forward because you had mentioned, Cedar Mountain, and then off to the Second Manassas campaign, and that carries right. So, like, it seems like events carry him forward in command, and during that process, of course, it becomes his army. And Joe Johnston's back in Richmond, like, can I come back now? Can I come back now? Do you think there's ever a chance Joe Johnston's coming back? Ever?
No, not unless something happened to Lee. No, he was not coming back because he wasn't complaining to Lee, but there are other things. Johnston was writing to other people, saying, I see what Lee is doing with my army type of deal. But no, I don't think there was any chance, of him ever taking command of the army. A couple exceptions. Lee has a heart attack in April of '63. Had he been forced to step down from that, maybe he resigns after, or he offers to resign after Gettysburg. That was another maybe. Johnston comes back into the picture. Of course, that would have been after he and Davis really got into it over strategy about Vicksburg. So it's probably less likely in the post Gettysburg time frame there. But yeah, in the spring of '63, maybe when maybe Davis would have been looking to get Johnston out of the West and do something else with him. Who
Uh,
knows?
So he gets sent. Johnson gets sent out to the West. I think he underperforms. He's moping. Really, it's like the nadir of his career. I'm hard on Johnson for his service in Mississippi in particular. Others maybe a little less so, but Johnson still manages to find redemption and gets command of Braxton Bragg's army following the Confederate defeat at Chattanooga. So Johnston finally gets that field command back, but it takes a while. Um, how's the relationship then between Lee and Johnston, commanding separate field armies, both in very important theaters, new campaign starting up in '64? There's a lot of pressure. The election's coming up. I mean, this is like a perfect storm of pressure. Um,
Mhm.
what's going through their minds at that point? What's Lee thinking as all this is getting started? And, how does that jive with where Johnson's at?
Yeah, you mentioned Johnson succeeding Bragg. Lee actually thought he was going to get that gig. So that's one of those things. I wish any of the people that had been in that room had written down what actually transpired. Because when Lee leaves his headquarters in Orange and goes to Richmond, when all this is going down, after the fall of Chattanooga. He tells Jeb Stuart, practically as he's getting on the train to head to Richmond, I've been nice serving with you. I'll always love this army, but I think I'm off to Georgia, type of thing. Uh, so Lee really thought he was going to get command of the Army of Tennessee. He didn't think he was going to be able to talk Davis out of it. Somehow he did. Like I say, I'd love to know what transpired during those conferences. He was able to change Davis's mind, but he didn't write it down. Davis didn't write it down. Nobody else that was in the room wrote it down. But something changed his mind, and he was able to convince Davis to give Johnston the army. So yeah, it was great piece of maneuvering there on Lee's part. How much of it was, trying to save himself from going out there, and how much was looking out for Johnston? I don't know. Probably a lot of both. But yeah, once Lee is secure back with the Army in Northern Virginia, he's uh, I know he was looking to Johnston to help improve that army. He sent I don't remember when he did it, but I know he sent Pendleton out there, partly because he didn't want Pendleton. He was trying to find something for Pendleton to do. He sends Pendleton out there to the Army of Tennessee to do an inspection of the artillery arm of that army. Later on, he tries to send Ewell out there to Johnston. So he's all of this is ostensibly, trying to help the Army of Tennessee. And truthfully, some of the commanders out there were so bad, having Pendleton and Ewell may have actually improved it. But he was also trying to, shed some of the dead weight from his own army at that point. So yeah, it's interesting. But yeah, I think it was one of those things where, Lee was interested in what was going on out there. Later on, he tells him, don't send Hood out there.
Right.
Hood's not up to this type of thing. But he was really just Virginia focused at this point, especially with Grant entering the picture. He didn't really have time to
Yeah.
concern himself with what's going on outside of Virginia, honestly.
Now you mentioned Hood, and of course, when Davis finally gets fed up with Johnston falling back to Atlanta, Hood is one of the top contenders to take Johnston's place. And Davis asks Lee his opinion about Hood, and Lee's gentlemanship comes through, and he's like, well, if it was my decision, he doesn't like flat out criticize Hood, but he certainly does not give him a ringing endorsement. Is
Right.
that because he doesn't have confidence in Hood? Is it because he has more confidence in Johnson? Is he looking out for his old friend? Like, walk me through that moment because I think that it's an important moment in the Lee Johnston relationship that maybe gets overlooked a little bit.
Right. I think it was more Hood is not the man for this job type of thing. Let's not be hasty,
Okay.
and jump into this. He knew Hood, Hood and AP Hill, are similar. They're great fighters on the battlefield, but Hood in particular, just completely in over his head, administratively, So, when you're looking at, comparing how long is an army in camp or on the march and how long are they fighting, Hood can handle this part not so much.
Yeah. Okay.
And it's he's Hood definitely needs somebody looking over his shoulder. Don't have him out there making all the important decisions himself. I think it was more Lee knew Hood's shortcomings than anything else, and just knew this was going to be a mistake if Davis did it. But Davis didn't want to hear it. I think
Right.
at this point he was just so fed up with Johnston. He would have put anybody in there, and Hood was the new shiny, the new toy, so to speak. So hey, let's see what he can do.
Yeah, yeah, and again, I guess Davis frustrated with Johnston's Fabian tactics, which I think at that time of the war, the Confederacy just needed to delay to the
Mhm.
election.
Yeah,
Johnston's maybe doing what the Confederacy needs, but again, they want something more aggressive and offensive. And for Lee to say like Hood's maybe too much of that is saying something because Lee's very offensive minded, I think, and I mean that's a very telling comment. Um, so that command change gets made, and Hood out there, and then Lee and Johnston's postscript, I think, is just a fascinating part of their relationship, where Hood destroys the army at Franklin and Nashville. Someone's got to pick up the pieces, And Lee basically says only Joe Johnston can do this. Why is it that Lee so strongly endorses Johnston in 1865? And tell me a little bit about that, because to me that's just a really amazing vote of confidence.
Right. When Lee is first made general in chief, Johnston was not happy about it because he was, I don't remember the specifics of what it was. There's one letter that I'm thinking of, but like I say, I can't remember the specifics. So I really wish I could. And I also wish I hadn't brought this up because now I look stupid for saying, hey, there's this thing, but I can't remember anything about it. But yeah, there was an incident where Johnston was not overly happy at Lee's appointment. And when he found out that Lee was putting him in charge down there, he thought that Lee was making him the scapegoat, there's no way in hell, we can stop Sherman down here. And now he's putting me down here. They just want to put the nail in the coffin of my career type of deal. And Lee writes to him and says, that is absolutely not the case. Like you just said, Joe Johnston is the guy that can do this. There's really nobody else we can turn to at this point. Nobody's going to serve under Bragg. Beauregard, still has these grandiose delusions of going and invading Ohio with troops that don't exist. Johnston, he's the master of defeat. If Sherman makes a mistake, Johnston will pounce on him, but Johnston is probably not going to make a mistake of his own. That's the best we can hope for
Yeah, right.
at this point. He's not going to, hood up the army, and just, go kill off, 50% of them in a stupid attack. Uh,
And
so
that's an assessment Sherman ultimately says of Johnson
yeah,
too. Like this
yeah,
dude is really good.
yeah, yeah. So part of it, was the friendship, because Lee had to diffuse that. Johnston was really irked at this, and Lee was able to assuage him and say, "No, I'm not making you the scapegoat. I think you are the guy to do this." And because of their friendship and their earlier relationship, Joe believed him, and I don't think it could have turned out. I mean, nobody was going to win, but I don't know what else Joe could have done. I think he
Right.
did the best with what he had. Considering part of what he had was Braxton Bragg. But
And it seems to me too, like that's a moment where Johnson becomes a true believer in Lee. There's this tension and this jealousy, and I lost my army to this guy, and blah blah blah. And like I really feel in 65, he drank the Kool-Aid. He's all in on Team Lee at this point after he kind of has this conversation with Lee.
right,
Um, and even in the last days of the siege of Petersburg, Lee's still planning to somehow try to link up with Johnson. Like Johnson might still be able to save the day if we can all kind of get together.
right, right. I don't know how realistic that was, but they both realized if they had any shot at all, they had to somehow join their forces before Grant and Sherman could combine forces. Um, I don't think there was ever any way that it was going to happen, but shot in the dark, it's better to try that than to do nothing.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was the ultimate goal. There was for Lee to figure out how to get away from Petersburg, and to for Johnston to move northward. They were probably going to meet somewhere around Greensboro, just because that's where the railroads would have taken them. But yeah, Sherman and Grant, there's no way they would have allowed that to happen, especially with Sheridan's cavalry, out there. It wouldn't have taken much to block one or the other of them from that juncture.
Now, Beauregard has left our conversation for a while, but since I mentioned Petersburg, that's where Beauregard comes back into our conversation because he gets sent out west and links up with Albert Sidney Johnston for a while, and he kind of messes up his own chance at command because he takes his unauthorized vacation. Pardon me, I have a herd of elephants pounding in my background here. So then when Beauregard ends up in Charleston, and finally he ends up south of the James, commanding the troops around Petersburg in 1864. And as Lee's falling back and Grant can't get at Lee, he sets his sights on Petersburg and attacks there on June 18th or 17th around the Dimmock Line. And Beauregard has to save the day with like 2,200 troops and a mostly completed defensive position.
Mhm.
And Beauregard, I think, does a fantastic job at Petersburg.
Mhm.
But Lee doesn't believe him. Like, oh, I got a problem here. And Lee doesn't seem to believe him. How come?
Lee was just so convinced that Grant was not going to leave his front. And Grant had done a good job of sending part of Butler's army up to Lee's front. So, Lee's intel was, no, the Army of the James is up here in my front. They can't possibly be in your front. And I know there's no way the Army of the Potomac is down there. Lee just did not want to believe that Grant could steal a march and cross the James River without him knowing it. And he refused to accept this for several days, and by the time he finally did accept it, it's, past, the emergency point here. He has to send troops across the pontoon bridge there at Drury's Bluff, as quickly as possible. They're almost worn out by the time they get to Petersburg. But yeah, that was undoubtedly, in my mind at least, Beauregard's greatest hour of the war was in that initial defense of Petersburg there. And just for whatever reason, Lee just refused to believe that Grant could get away. Even though he'd been saying himself all along, the next logical move for Grant is to leave Cold Harbor and cross the James. He was predicting it, but when Grant does it, he refuses to believe it. So that just blows my mind. I think part of that, Lee had been quite sick earlier in the month at the end of May, beginning of June. He had been just completely laid out. The thing you said about Venable earlier, Lee in his tent is not Lee in the field. That's when Venable said this. And Venable and Lee got into it at one point there at the North Anna. Lee refused to turn over command to anybody. Venable and others were proposing, get Beauregard up from Petersburg to take command of the Army in Northern Virginia, and Lee refused to do it. And that's what led to the missed opportunity there at North Anna. I think there were probably still some lingering effects, even in mid-June at Cold Harbor there for Lee. But that's always been a mystery to me. Why didn't he believe that Grant did the very thing that Lee himself said he's going to do? So I don't know. That was weird.
Is there a trust issue with Beauregard? Because I've thought about that in the context of North Anna, where yeah, we could get him up here, take a day to get him up here, but Beauregard could get here, and Lee's like, no, 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 I don't want to let that happen. Like, is he just not trust Beauregard, or is he more of afraid like he'll get the Joe Johnston treatment, where like if he steps out of command, he'll never get it back?
I don't know what the reasoning was. I don't think he'd have to worry about losing his job to Beauregard, given the relationship that he had with Davis. I don't think that really would have been a factor. But I don't know if it was a trust issue or what it was. I just I don't think he was thinking with a clear head. Is part of it. I really think his judgment was so clouded he wasn't thinking clearly. I think he had confidence that AP Hill could handle things, because Ewell was out of the picture at this point. Longstreet's been wounded, but Hill was having one of his bouts of too much fun at West Point flaring up, and it really, I don't think Lee was prepared for that. I really think, this is my personal opinion, I don't have anything to back this up, but I really
Gotcha.
think he thought AP Hill could handle this. But what the I don't know what the specific reason would have been for no Beauregard. Like I say, I just think Lee was not thinking clearly due to this illness.
Yeah, yeah. And when they get to Petersburg and things start unfolding, and it takes Lee a significant amount of time to sort of react and finally shift the bulk of his troops and attention down there. Um, and does he work okay with Beauregard as they kind of finally settle into a common defense?
Yeah, they seem to work well together because once it became apparent that Grant was going to be fighting on both sides of the James and Lee had to react to that, normally Lee would command north of the James and leave Beauregard in command at Petersburg, and that seemed to work well. Uh, I mean, there were some hiccups to this. There was one of the early attempts to drive the Federals away. Beauregard was in tactical command of it. It was Robert Hoke and Charles Field's divisions,
Oh yeah,
and they didn't work well together, not just at Petersburg, but they didn't work well together north of the river. So, you can't blame that on Petersburg. I think that was just really Charles Field was out of his element, at
yeah,
division command. But, and Beauregard, was just, he was dealt a poor hand, I think, in the division commanders that he had by this point. No knock against Hoke, but, division commanders in 64, 65 are not up to the same level that they were in 62, 63. You're seeing these
Sure.
guys, the third stringers, if not worse at this point. But yeah, Beauregard and Lee seem to work fine at Petersburg, which makes it the whole I'm not turning the army over to him at North Anna even more strange to me because, they definitely worked well together down there at Petersburg. And in fact, you read some of their correspondence, and there's actually friendship. There's some warmth there between the two of them,
Yeah.
especially when Beauregard left. Lee, I sincerely regret your leaving. It's been great working with you here. And it was not just the Magruder send off of hey, good luck in Texas type of thing. I truly will miss having you here to rely on. So
Yeah.
yeah,
So, and probably maybe the most important factor in all of this is we're talking about these command dynamics. Of course, like Johnson and Davis had a poisonous relationship that just got worse. Beauregard and Davis had a relationship that got worse over the course of the war. And I always characterize Lee and Davis as like Lee played Davis like a violin. Like he knew how to get what he needed from Davis. And I think you said earlier, like Lee had a way of phrasing things to Davis where Davis would think it was his idea and be like, "Oh yeah, let's do it." Tell me your overall impression of like how important are those command decisions in the way all of this unfolded? That's a big question. I apologize.
yeah, that is a big question. um, yeah, it was. I think Lee and Davis too really lost faith in Beauregard there towards the end of the war. I forget when it occurred. It was sometime in early '65, I think, where uh, it he stopped short of saying Beauregard has lost his mind, but there's something wrong with Beauregard. Look at some of his latest correspondence. This was when he was proposing, to gather up every available soldier in the South and go
Yeah.
cross over and invade Ohio. And he had some other weird ideas that just they wouldn't even have been feasible earlier in the war, let alone in 1865. But yeah, they Lee really started to lose faith in Beauregard there towards the end as the war was winding down, and I think it was kind of contagious, except when it came to the evacuation of Richmond. Really what Lee thought in a lot of cases is what Davis thought. A lot of times,
Yeah.
um, but I know I'm not answering the question here, but
No, but I think you're hitting at the idea that it's
yeah.
just things get wonky and never improve. Uh,
Yeah, and when they were, trying to find assignments, after Hood was relieved, they want to send Beauregard out to clean up his mess, and then they want, I think, some point they tried to send him out to Southwest Virginia, or maybe that was Hood. I might be getting them confused at this point, but they're, you're looking for things to do, with these, four-star generals,
yeah.
that in a lot of cases, a brigadier general could do, and things are just getting overly top heavy with the command structure at the end. And
Yeah, what are we
um,
going to do with John Pemberton? He's a
yeah,
lieutenant general, like that
yeah,
kind of thing. Yeah.
yeah, wonky is a good way to describe it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, as we wrap up our conversation, how would you best describe Lee as a manager of relationships? Because I'll leave it at that. Let me have you answer that. How do you describe Lee as a manager of relationships?
Um, some of them worked for him, some of them didn't. I mean, there were some individuals he was never able to figure out. And other individuals, he just clicked with right off the bat. Some it took a little bit of work to figure out how to get the best out of some of his commanders. uh, some people just they could not function under Lee's style of command, Ewell and the whole if practicable type of thing. That's you know Lee really depended a lot on his subordinate commanders. Some of them thrived under that, like Jackson. Others, like Ewell, never really grasped it. And um, then you got guys, like Jubal Early. I think he was one of the best field commanders Lee ever had. The two of
Yeah.
them worked well together. Early understood what Lee wanted, big picture and small picture. When as a tactician on the battlefield, and then as an independent commander out in the valley. So It really varied. Like I say, some people Lee could not figure out. Henry Wise was one, from beginning to end. He never could
Uh,
figure out Henry Wise. He's probably the best example I can think of. But, some of these other guys, that they're not really household names because they disappeared from the Army of Northern Virginia early on because Lee couldn't work with them. D.H. Hill's another one he could never figure out.
oh yeah,
He
right.
said repeatedly, Hill does great things on a battlefield, but he straight up says, I cannot function in this manner, when it came to relations with Hill, because there was one specific incident. I forget what it was about, but, Hill refused to act without specific instructions from Lee. Lee sent him instructions, and Hill says, no, I'm not going to do that. Lee was pulling his hair out, I can't deal with this guy. So, like everybody, there are some people you just can't work with. Lee was no different in that.
Yeah.
It's all about chemistry and relationships between individual people.
Yeah, and I really love that answer because, of course, people sort of assume that Lee passes down an edict and people do what he says, except for Longstreet, who maybe pushes back, and now Longstreet gets a bad flack for that, And it's but like there are a lot of relationships he had trouble managing, and many he managed better than others. Great answer. Really like that answer a lot. So I'll remind folks, Charlie's got a great book, From Arlington to Appomattox, Robert E. Lee, Day by Day. And I think one of the best comprehensive Civil War resources out there. And I appreciate you spending some time chatting with us today, a little bit about Lee and his relationships with Johnston and Beauregard.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I'm Chris Mackowski for the Emerging Civil War podcast. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.